dawn broke over Tokyo Bay on April 7, 1945. As 91 North American P-51D Mustangs of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups approached their rendezvous point above the Japanese home islands. In his cockpit, Major James B. Tapp gripped the control stick of his Mustang, its six-wing mounted, 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Below, Mount Fuji stood majestically against the clear morning sky, its snow-capped peak serving as a navigation landmark that would guide pilots throughout their unprecedented mission. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Japanese countryside, revealing a patchwork of rice fields, villages, and military installations that had never before witnessed American fighters. This mission represented something military planners had deemed impossible just 2 years earlier, escorting B-29 Superfortresses deep into the Japanese homeland from a base 750 miles away, a distance that challenged every assumption about single-engine fighter capabilities. At 0700 hours, more than 100 Japanese interceptors converged on the American formation. Through the morning haze came a sight that shocked Japanese pilots to their core: single-engine American fighters over Tokyo, something their commanders had assured them was impossible. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. These were not carrier-based Navy fighters with limited range, but land-based Army Air Force fighters that had somehow crossed 750 miles of open ocean to appear over the imperial capital. Leading the Japanese defense were pilots flying the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, codenamed Frank by the Allies, Japan's fastest and most advanced fighter, alongside older Ki-40s, Ki-44 Shodens, Ki-61 Hyans and Navy A6M0s and N1K2J Shidens. The Ki-84 could outclimb and outmaneuver both the P-51 and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt at certain altitudes and speeds. What happened next would demonstrate the vast technological gulf between two nations' approaches to air warfare, and reveal why American industrial might had produced what many pilots would call the perfect long-range fighter aircraft. The North American P-51D Mustang had arrived in the Pacific theater with a reputation already forged in European skies, where it had broken the back of the Luftwaffe and made daylight bombing of Germany possible. Developed initially for export to Britain, the aircraft had been transformed through British modifications using Rolls-Royce Merlin engines into America's most capable wartime fighter. This transformation from Allison-powered early variants to the Merlin-powered masterpiece represented one of aviation's most successful international collaborations, a marriage of American aerodynamic innovation and British engine technology. The Packard V1657 engine, a license-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66, delivered 695 horsepower at takeoff with water injection, rising to 720 horsepower in emergency war power settings. This two-stage, two-speed supercharged power plant could maintain high performance at altitudes where Japanese engines gasped for air, their single-stage superchargers unable to compress the thin atmosphere sufficiently. The P-51D achieved a maximum speed of approximately 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, reached an operating ceiling of almost 42,000 feet, and was armed with 6 wing-mounted 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. The mathematics of firepower were devastating and precisely calculated. 6 M2 Browning machine guns firing at 800 rounds per minute each meant the P-51D could deliver 800 rounds per minute of concentrated firepower, 80 rounds per second. Each armor-piercing incendiary round weighed 46 grams and traveled at 900 feet per second, delivering tremendous kinetic energy capable of penetrating aircraft armor, igniting fuel tanks, and destroying engines with just a few well-placed hits. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter squadrons of the U.S. 8th Air Force in Europe were composed of Mustangs, testament to the aircraft's superiority over all other available fighters. This massive deployment reflected American industrial capacity at its peak, with assembly lines running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. North American aviation's factories in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, were producing P-51s at a rate that staggered the imagination. At peak production, a new Mustang rolled off the assembly line every hour. The very long-range capability that brought Mustangs to Tokyo represented a revolution in fighter operations that changed the fundamental mathematics of air warfare. With dual 110-gallon drop tanks, Mustangs could fly round trips of 500 statute miles as a matter of routine, though pilots would push this to 600 miles when necessary. This was equivalent to flying from Los Angeles to Little Rock, Arkansas, entirely over water in a single-engine aircraft with no alternate landing sites except the ocean. The key to this achievement lay in the Merlin engine's exceptional fuel efficiency at cruise settings, consuming just 65 gallons per hour at economical cruise, combined with the P-51's laminar flow wing design that reduced drag by 35% compared to conventional airfoils. The laminar flow wing, developed by North American's aerodynamicist Edgar Shumud, maintained smooth airflow over a greater percentage of the wing surface, delaying the transition to turbulent flow and dramatically reducing parasitic drag. Standing in stark contrast was the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, which entered operational service with the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service in June 1944, too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. Named Gale and designated Frank by the Allies, this fighter represented Japan's desperate attempt to match American technological superiority with what resources remained to the embattled empire. The Ki-84 was generally considered the best Japanese fighter to operate in large numbers during the conflict. Though large numbers was relative, what Japan considered mass production, America would consider prototype runs. The aircraft boasted high speed and excellent maneuverability with an armament of up to 230 mm, 155 cannons and 220 mm 5 cannons that gave it formidable firepower on paper. The reality was more complex. The 30 mm cannons carried only 50 rounds per gun, the 20 mm cannons just 150 rounds per gun, giving a total ammunition load of just 400 rounds compared to the Mustang's 880 to 2800 rounds. The Ki-84 was powered by the Nakajima Ki-85 Hayate, an 18-cylinder radial engine with fuel injection, and a single-stage, 2-speed supercharger using water-methanol injection. This complex piece of machinery was rated at 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. Initial testing showed promise, with prototypes reaching 387 miles per hour in level flight and later claims of up to 427 miles per hour under ideal conditions with high-octane fuel and perfect engine tuning. However, the reality of late-war Japanese production told a dramatically different story. One of declining quality, desperate improvisation, and systemic failure. The Homer engine, while theoretically powerful and advanced, suffered from chronic reliability problems that worsened as quality control collapsed. The engine required precise tolerances that Japanese factories, under constant B-29 bombardment and lacking quality steel and aluminum, could no longer maintain. Many landing gear units were compromised by poor, quality heat treatment of late-war Japanese steel, often containing impurities that made proper hardening impossible. As a result, many Hayates suffered struck collapses on landing, writing off aircraft that Japan could not afford to lose and killing pilots that took months to train. The disparity in production quality reflected the broader industrial crisis facing Japan, a nation that had gambled everything on a short war and lost. While American factories maintained consistent quality standards despite massive production volumes, actually improving quality as production techniques were refined, Japanese manufacturing deteriorated precipitously. By 1945, Japan had produced only 3 542 Ki-84s total, and many of these were grounded due to lack of spare parts, fuel, or qualified pilots. Of those that were operational, perhaps half could be considered truly combat-ready at any given time. The fuel situation alone revealed the strategic catastrophe facing Japan. While American pilots flew with 100-octane aviation gasoline shipped from refineries in Texas and California, fuel specifically formulated for high-performance engines, Japanese pilots made do with whatever could be produced domestically or synthesized from coal. Late-war Japanese aviation fuel often tested at 87 octane or lower, sometimes as low as 80 octane, robbing engines of power and causing pre-ignition that destroyed cylinders, pistons, and valves. Some desperate units attempted to supplement their fuel with pine root oil extracted from pine stumps, alcohol distilled from sweet potatoes, and even sake production byproducts, further degrading engine performance and reliability. Pilots reported engines that would barely start, ran rough at all power settings, and often failed catastrophically in flight. On that first April 7th mission, the Mustangs formed up with their charges, 103 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses of the 73rd Bomb Wing, each carrying tons of incendiary bombs destined for Japanese industrial targets. The Rendezvous itself represented a triumph of navigation and planning that would have been impossible without American technological advantages. Crossing the coast of Honshu, the P-51 pilots dropped their 110-gallon auxiliary wing tanks as they began to spot the first head on feints from a force of more than 100 Japanese interceptors scrambling from multiple airfields around Tokyo. The silver drop tanks tumbled earthward, glinting in the morning sun, some exploding as they hit the ground, others bouncing across rice paddies. The Japanese pilots, flying a mixed force of Ki-84s, Ki-43s, Ki-44s, Ki-61s and Navy fighters including Zeros and the new N-1K2J Shiden Kai, experienced their first shock. These were not Navy carrier fighters with limited range, but land-based fighters that had somehow reached the homeland from bases they knew were impossibly distant. Flight Sergeant Toranosuke Takamizawa, flying a Ki-84 with the 56th Sentai, later recalled his disbelief. When we were scrambled, we were told enemy fighters were approaching Tokyo. We thought it must be a mistake. Perhaps they meant enemy bombers. When I saw the Mustangs with my own eyes, I thought I was dreaming. It was impossible. Our commanders had assured us that no American fighter could reach Japan from their island bases. Yet there they were, dozens of them, flying as if they owned our sky. In that moment I knew the war was truly lost. Major James B. Tapp, later to become an ace with 8 confirmed victories, was one of the first Mustang pilots to tear into a formation of Japanese fighters. His combat report, written hours after the mission, described the engagement with clinical precision. They came at us in the traditional 3-plane Shotai formation, but their coordination was poor. The flight leader would commit to an attack, but his wingmen often failed to follow through. They seemed hesitant, perhaps low on fuel or ammunition, or simply inexperienced. We dove through them with a 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage, fired quick bursts, and climbed back to altitude before they could react. This breakdown in Japanese tactical coordination reflected the crisis in pilot training that had reached catastrophic proportions. By 1945, most experienced Japanese pilots were dead, killed over the Solomons, New Guinea, the Philippines, or in the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Replacements received as little as 50 hours of flight training before being thrown into combat, compared to the 600 hours American pilots received before deploying to combat theaters. When the smoke cleared and the Mustangs returned to their Iwo Jima base, the Sunsetters of 7th Fighter Command were credited with 26 Japanese planes destroyed, 1 probable, and 5 damaged at a cost of 2 P-51s and 1 pilot. The 13-to-1 kill ratio on this first mission would only improve as American pilots gained experience over Japan and Japanese pilot quality continued to deteriorate. The performance differential between the aircraft became starkly apparent in combat, particularly in the vertical dimension where air combat was increasingly fought. The P-51D's superiority was particularly evident above 20,000 feet, the altitude where most interceptions took place. At these altitudes, the Merlin engine's 2-stage supercharger maintained sea-level power while Japanese engines struggled for breath. At 30,000 feet, the Ki-84 could barely maintain 350 miles per hour, while the P-51D could still achieve 420 miles per hour. Lieutenant Jerry Yellin of the 78th Fighter Squadron, who would fly the last combat mission of the war on August 14, 1945, described a typical engagement. Would spot them climbing up to meet us, leaving dark exhaust trails as they firewalled their throttles. But by 25,000 feet, they were wallowing like fish out of water. Their engines were smoking, probably running too rich, because their superchargers couldn't provide enough air. We'd dive through their formation with our 50s blazing, and they simply couldn't match our speed in the dive or our climb afterward. The contrast in pilot quality was devastating and grew worse with each passing day. American pilots arriving at Iwo Jima typically had 400 to 600 hours of flight time, including 100+ hours in type, dozens of hours of gunnery practice, and extensive combat training. Japanese pilots in 1945 often had less than 100 hours total time, sometimes as little as 30 hours, with minimal gunnery practice due to ammunition shortages and no instrument training. The logistics supporting each force revealed the true nature of the Pacific Air War, a contest between American abundance and Japanese scarcity. Every mission from Iwo Jima involved nearly 100 Mustangs consuming 57,000 gallons of high-octane fuel and carrying 230,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, plus bombs and rockets for ground attack missions. Behind this stood a supply chain stretching back to factories in Detroit, refineries in Texas, and ammunition plants in Missouri, all connected by Liberty ships produced at a rate of 3 per day. Meanwhile, Japanese logistics had collapsed into chaos and desperation. Aviation fuel was so scarce that training flights were cancelled, leaving new pilots to face combat with no recent flying experience. Ammunition was rationed even for combat missions, with pilots told to conserve rounds for only the most certain shots. The technological sophistication gap extended beyond the aircraft themselves to every aspect of operations. American pilots wore G-suits that prevented blackouts in high-G maneuvers, used standardized oxygen systems that functioned reliably above 30,000 feet, and communicated via VHF radios with clear reception. Japanese pilots often flew without functioning radios, used unreliable oxygen systems that frequently failed above 20,000 feet, and had no G-suits, limiting their ability to match American aggressive maneuvering. The impact on Japanese morale was catastrophic and irreversible. Captain Yoshio Yoshida, a Ki-84 pilot with the 47th Sentai who survived the war, wrote in his diary, "The appearance of American fighters over Tokyo has shattered our confidence completely. We were told the B-29s were vulnerable without escort, that their fighters could never reach so far. Now we see Mustangs over the palace itself, strafing our airfields in broad daylight, shooting down our best pilots as if they were beginners. The sight of those Mustangs, so confident, so numerous, tells us what our leaders will not. The war is lost, and we are simply waiting to die." The very long-range missions were a test of flying skill. As Major Tapp noted in a post-war interview, battling Japanese fighter pilots caused your adrenaline to flow, but getting from point A to point B was the hardest part. The ocean was endless, featureless, hypnotic. You'd check your compass constantly, wondering if it was wrong, if you'd somehow gotten turned around. The physical and mental strain was enormous and cumulative. Pilots stayed strapped into their cockpits for 8 hours or more, unable to stand, unable to stretch, dealing with cramping legs, numb buttocks, and the constant anxiety of flying a single-engine aircraft over vast stretches of empty ocean where one mechanical failure meant almost certain death. The Mustang's cockpit ergonomics, refined through 3 years of combat experience and thousands of pilot reports, proved superior to Japanese designs in every measurable way. The P-51D featured a bubble canopy providing 360-degree visibility, fully adjustable seat and rudder pedals, and logically arranged instruments. The Ki-84's cockpit, while an improvement over earlier Japanese fighters, still suffered from poor rear visibility, awkwardly placed controls, and instruments difficult to read in combat conditions. Armament differences proved decisive in combat outcomes. The P-51D's .50 caliber machine guns, while seemingly less impressive than the Ki-84's mixed cannon armament, offered crucial advantages that combat experience had proven decisive. The American guns were extraordinarily reliable, with stoppage rates below 1%, carried far more ammunition 180 to 800 rounds total compared to the Ki-84's 400 rounds, and had well-understood ballistics that allowed reliable engagement at 400 yards. The training difference in gunnery was even more pronounced. American pilots had fired thousands of rounds in training, learning deflection shooting until it became instinctive. Japanese pilots in 1945 were lucky to fire 100 rounds in training, if that. Many went into their first combat having never fired their guns at all. 5. Iwo Jima's Mustangs were credited with 206 Japanese airplanes shot down between April and August, 75% of the Pacific P-51 aerial victories. The strategic impact extended far beyond aerial victories to reshape the entire Pacific War. The presence of P-51s over Japan meant B-29s could bomb in daylight with greater accuracy, systematically destroying Japan's industrial infrastructure. The psychological effect was equally devastating. Japanese civilians could see American fighters strafing airfields in broad daylight, making clear that Japan had lost control of its own airspace. The myth of the divine wind that would protect Japan was shattered when American fighters flew over the imperial palace itself. The industrial mathematics were irrefutable. The United States produced 15 586 P-51s of all variants during the war, more than Japan's total production of all aircraft types in 1944 and 1945 combined. Japan managed to produce approximately 3,500 Ki-84s, but many were destroyed on the ground, lost in training accidents, or grounded for lack of parts. The transformation was complete by war's end. On August 14, 1945, Lieutenant Jerry Yellin flew what would be the last combat mission of the war, attacking airfields near Nagoya. Even in defeat, with the Emperor having already recorded his surrender broadcast, Japanese anti-aircraft positions continued firing. But notably absent were Japanese fighters. They had essentially ceased to exist as an effective force. The mathematics of the air war were final and irrefutable, written in aluminum and blood across the skies of Japan. The P-51D Mustang, with its 440-mile-per-hour top speed, 2,000-mile range with drop tanks, and 6 reliable machine guns with nearly 2,000 rounds of ammunition, had rendered the Japanese home islands defenseless against daylight air attack. American industrial might, expressed through the magnificent P-51 Mustang, had achieved what naval blockade and island hopping could not the complete elimination of Japan's ability to defend its airspace. The B-29s that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki flew without fighter escort, not because none was available, but because none was needed. Japanese fighter opposition had been swept from the skies, crushed by the overwhelming superiority of American technology, training, and production. The shock experienced by Japanese pilots encountering P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo was more than tactical surprise. It was the stunning realization that American industrial capacity and technological advancement had made even the impossible routine. The P-51D Mustang over Mount Fuji was not just an aircraft, it was the embodiment of American industrial supremacy, technological innovation, and the inexorable mathematics of total war. The lesson was clear and brutal in modern industrial warfare. Superior technology multiplied by massive production equals victory. Against this mathematical reality, individual courage, however admirable, could not prevail. The divine wind had been conquered by science, the warrior spirit broken by industrial might, and the empire of the rising sun overshadowed by wings of aluminum and engines of steel.